In just 7 minutes, Justice Clarence Thomas fined Jasmine Crockett $500 million. Without trial, without evidence, without mercy. The courtroom froze, the cameras rolled, and the nation watched in disbelief as a sitting Supreme Court justice tried to bury a rising Congresswoman alive. But what Jasmine did next ignited a firestorm that ripped through the justice system like a political earthquake. In the days that followed, careers unraveled, secrets exploded into the open, and the balance of power in Washington shifted. What exactly did Jasmine do that brought the nation's most untouchable institutions to their knees? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The air outside the Alexandria Federal Courthouse sliced through coats and collars like broken glass. Washington hadn't seen a freeze this sharp in years, but what waited inside was colder still. At exactly 8:03 a.m., a convoy of black Suburbans rolled up to the granite steps like a funeral procession. Jasmine Crockett stepped out of the second vehicle, not in handcuffs, not under arrest, but summoned less than 24 hours earlier on a sealed emergency motion accusing her of donor fraud related to the federal Hope Forward initiative. No prior notice, no chance to prepare. The allegation came without specifics, but with consequences written in fire. Her breath curled into the air, fogging the lens of a reporter's camera before vanishing like smoke. Inside, the press gallery had reached critical mass, shoulders packed tight, microphones blooming from clenched fists like weapons. Everyone knew something was off. This wasn't a criminal trial, yet the atmosphere buzzed like a death sentence had already been passed. And then the bombshell detonated. Presiding over today's civil hearing, by personal and unexplained request, was none other than Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. Civil suits didn't fall under his authority. So why was he here? What was so urgent, so politically radioactive, that a sitting justice had descended from Olympus to wield the gavel himself? Jasmine sat silently at the defense table, her back straight, her expression unreadable, but her presence unmistakable. She wasn't there to fold. She was there to fight, even if the rules had already been burned before her arrival. Across the aisle loomed Malcolm Reed, the federal prosecutor with a taste for blood and a camera-ready smirk. A man more familiar with Sunday talk shows than the courtroom protocol. He didn't look at Jasmine. He looked through her, the way a hunter eyes a mount he's already decided will hang above his fireplace. The courtroom's paneled walls seemed to close in, every knot in the wood whispering betrayal, every flickering light casting judgment. Cameras rolled, live streams exploded. Across the country, millions tuned in. This wasn't jurisprudence, it was performance. And Jasmine Crockett, young, black, unbending, was painted not as the accused, but the already condemned. There had been no discovery phase, no jury, no hearing of the facts, just an allegation, a target, and a trap. This court hadn't gathered for justice. It had gathered to crush a voice that had risen too high. But before anyone could process the surreal gravity of the moment, before her team could even object, Justice Clarence Thomas raised the gavel and brought it down with a thundering finality that didn't echo law, but execution. The courtroom froze mid-breath. Without deliberation, without a single word from the defense, Thomas delivered the blow like a man dropping a guillotine. This court finds Representative Jasmine Crockett liable under civil fraud statutes, damages assessed at $500 million, he intoned, his voice as cold and mechanical as a stamp in a slaughterhouse. The words struck the air like a car crash. Reporters gasped. The court stenographer blinked, uncertain if she'd heard it right. Jasmine didn't flinch. Not because the number didn't stagger, it did, but because the sheer absurdity of the moment numbed everything else. $500 million. More than most cities could dream of budgeting. And not one document had been reviewed. Not one witness heard. Not one shred of context considered. In a country that claimed liberty and justice for all, Jasmine Crockett had just been publicly executed, without a trial, without a chance, and without mercy. Within minutes, the headlines ignited like a coordinated airstrike. Breaking, Congresswoman hit with $500 million fine in surprise civil ruling. Justice or political ambush? Thomas lowers the hammer. News anchors scrambled to interpret it, some with trembling disbelief, others with gleeful nods. Radio hosts turned Jasmine into a punchline. Online, the hashtags became tribal war banners. Crockett crushed versus justice hijacked. Political analysts shouted over each other on live TV. But to millions watching, it wasn't law they saw. It was punishment wrapped in procedure. A warning dressed as verdict. A black congresswoman had been silenced not by impeachment, not by scandal, but by the unchecked power of a courtroom willing to burn the Constitution just to bury her name. And the message couldn't have been clearer. Rise too far, speak too boldly, and they will not debate you. They will destroy you, not with bullets, but with gavels. But before the courtroom turned her into a symbol, before the cameras, the hashtags, the war over her name, there was a woman with no security detail, no title, and no gas in her tank, racing against a system that was never built to let her win. It was 6 years before her congressional badge. The summer heat in Dallas was merciless, shimmering off the asphalt as Jasmine Crockett slammed her car door and stared at the empty gas gauge blinking like a countdown. She was supposed to be in court in 12 minutes, representing a black grandmother facing eviction from a building owned by a state senator's cousin. No taxis, no ride shares, no backup. She kicked off her heels and ran. 2 blocks, in a pencil skirt, past honking horns and catcalls. Sweat poured down her spine, but her eyes never left the courthouse entrance, like it was the last open door to justice. She arrived with 30 seconds to spare, barefoot, flushed, and cross-examined the plaintiff's lawyer so cleanly that even the judge asked for her closing argument twice. She won that case, not because she was polished, but because she was dangerous with the truth. Jasmine didn't grow up with generational wealth or prep school connections. She came from neighborhoods where the streetlights didn't always work, where grocery stores locked the formula behind glass, and where the only time you saw a lawyer was after something had gone wrong. She watched her mother cry over late bills and eviction notices, each one a warning shot from a system designed to squeeze the poor and excuse the powerful. She kept her first paycheck framed, $234, for defending a wrongfully accused teenager who hadn't spoken a word in court because no one had ever asked him anything that wasn't a threat. While others climbed through networking events and campaign galas, Jasmine fought her way up through protests, shelters, union meetings. Her name didn't rise on cocktail napkins. It was spray painted on cardboard signs at rallies. She didn't run for office because someone told her to. She ran because no one else would. There were no billionaires bankrolling her message, no TV spots dripping with endorsements, just folding chairs in church basements, microphones that crackled when she spoke, and a fire that couldn't be staged. The people who backed her had never voted before, but they came out for her. The women who cleaned the Capitol floors, the men who lost their pensions in rigged deals, the kids whose schools hadn't had working AC in 5 years. And when she won, by 612 votes, it wasn't called an upset. It was called a warning. Jasmine Crockett didn't ask permission to speak. She kicked the door open and told the truth so loud it echoed into the rotunda. And now the same system that ignored her rise was scrambling to engineer her fall. But while Jasmine's rise had been built in the open, fueled by people and purpose, her fall was being engineered behind closed doors, calculated, deliberate, and executed with surgical precision by men who feared what she represented. In a soundproof conference room 4 blocks from the Capitol, 3 men in tailored suits stared at a dossier stamped confidential. Malcolm Reed, the prosecutor who craved headlines like oxygen, leaned over the table, tapping a pen against the edge of Jasmine Crockett's photo. "She's too clean," he muttered, "but no one stays clean under pressure." Across from him sat 2 senior DOJ advisors, one of whom had direct ties to corporate PACs Jasmine had recently exposed on the House floor. They weren't afraid of her personality. They were afraid of her momentum. Focus groups showed she was making inroads with independents, even conservative veterans. Her speeches weren't viral fluff. They were fire alarms. The plan was ruthless but simple. Open a civil fraud investigation under vague donor mismanagement claims tied to the Hope Forward program, a policy Jasmine had championed. skip the indictment, skip the jury. Hit her with a fine so massive it would turn her into political roadkill before midterms. But for that to stick, they needed legitimacy. They needed a name that would make even the critics pause. That's when Clarence Thomas's name was floated. A symbol of conservative endurance, untouchable in robes and impossible to challenge without setting fire to the entire judiciary. On paper, it made no sense. A sitting Supreme Court justice presiding over a civil matter? But behind the scenes, it was genius. He wouldn't be the prosecutor. He wouldn't author the charges. He would simply be the face of the ruling. The hammer, not the hand. Reed made the call. One conversation, one private dinner, one promise that restoring trust in institutions required one highly visible verdict. Thomas didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. His invitation arrived on thick stationery, handwritten, unsigned. And 3 days later, without explanation, the highest court's shadow reached into a courtroom it didn't belong and wrapped itself around Jasmine Crockett's throat. The gavel had fallen, the cameras had caught it, and the vultures were already circling. But beneath the weight of injustice, Jasmine Crockett didn't crumble. She calculated. The courtroom was still vibrating with shock when Jasmine slowly turned her head, just slightly, toward her lead counsel. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't fumble for words. With the calm precision of someone who had seen this ambush coming from a mile away, she whispered, "It's time to flip the cards." 9 words. Quiet enough to be missed by most. But to her attorney, Illa Hartman, they were thunder. No outrage, no panic. Just the cool detonation of a woman who had waited patiently for the system to overplay its hand. Her eyes never left the bench. Her posture remained unshaken. But the temperature in the room shifted. What they had mistaken for surrender was strategy, and they had just stepped into her trap. Illa Hartman rose slowly, like a storm cloud forming on the edge of a still sky. A former federal investigator turned civil rights litigator, Illa was known in legal circles not for flash, but for precision, the kind of lawyer who never spoke unless the words could cut through steel. Every movement was intentional. No drama, no wasted motion. From beneath the defense table, she lifted a large, weathered golden envelope, thick with the weight of withheld truth. Its seal was unbroken, but the energy it carried was explosive. It came from deep inside the Department of Justice, smuggled out by a whistleblower who risked their career to expose a lie that had metastasized at the highest levels. Illa didn't speak as she approached the bench. Her heels struck the marble floor like a countdown. Reed sat motionless, knuckles white around his pen. Justice Thomas leaned forward, slightly, hesitantly, as if he sensed what was coming wasn't just evidence, but reckoning. The envelope was placed gently on the judge's desk, but it might as well have been a ticking bomb. For a moment, no one breathed. No cameras clicked. The room froze, because everyone in that chamber felt it. This wasn't courtroom procedure anymore. This was the sound of the system cracking open from the inside. As the envelope seal broke and its contents were slowly drawn into the light, the illusion of order gave way to the unmistakable scent of fear. Because what lay inside wasn't just evidence, it was exposure. Justice Clarence Thomas unfolded the first page with hands that had once signed landmark decisions without so much as a tremor. But this time the tremor came fast. It was a Department of Justice internal audit report, stamped confidential, dated 3 months before any charges were filed. The header read, "Preliminary findings, Hope Forward Initiative, donor classification discrepancies." As he read further, the courtroom seemed to constrict. The audit clearly and unequivocally stated that the financial irregularities in the Hope Forward program had originated from a third-party data software vendor, an automated back-end tool used to categorize donor data. It was a system error, not fraud, not deception, and certainly not Jasmine Crockett's doing. The report concluded that Representative Crockett had no administrative access, no oversight authority, and no prior awareness of the misclassification. She was, in the audit's words, a legislative sponsor, not an operational actor. Thomas blinked, his jaw stiffening. The audit alone was enough to unravel the case. But then he turned the page, and the oxygen seemed to leave the room. A second document emerged, not an audit, not a form, an email thread, internal DOJ correspondence, names redacted, but headers intact. Subject line, Crockett Optics. His eyes scanned the first line, and his lips parted in disbelief. If we don't move on her now, she'll dominate midterms. Use donor confusion. Public won't question a fine. The media will fill in the blanks. His hand paused. There were more. Another DOJ official had responded. Thomas will give the ruling teeth. A Supreme Court name kills the backlash. Timing matters. Get it done before October. A single low gasp echoed from the press gallery. Someone dropped a pen. Another reporter stood frozen mid-type, their fingers hovering inches above the keyboard. It wasn't just evidence of a cover-up. It was a coordinated operation. Weaponized optics, systemic manipulation, and a deliberate plan to destroy a public servant for political convenience. Justice Thomas's fingers tightened around the edge of the envelope. His eyes, bloodshot now, scanned the gallery, then slowly returned to the page. His voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper. This was never about justice. His hand shook. For the first time in over 30 years on the bench, the robe felt heavy. Not with honor, but with guilt. And Jasmine? She didn't blink. She didn't smile. She simply watched as the truth did what no protest, no speech, and no plea could ever accomplish. It cracked the marble throne beneath him. The air was thick with exposed truth. Every eye fixed on the man who had driven the dagger, now choking on its recoil. Malcolm Reed, once the golden boy of high-profile prosecutions, the man who dined with senators and grinned through Sunday talk shows, now sat frozen in his chair, blinking furiously as if sheer willpower could unsee what had just been laid bare. His fingers hovered over his files like they no longer knew how to hold paper. One folder slipped from his grasp and tumbled onto the courtroom floor with a slap loud enough to make people flinch. Loose documents spilled out in a pathetic scatter. Charts, headlines, exhibit notes, all of it now meaningless, like kindling after a flood. He reached for them on instinct, but his hand shook so badly he only succeeded in crumpling a corner. A low gasp came from his assistant, who leaned in, whispering something with urgency. Perhaps strategy, perhaps mercy. But Reed couldn't register it. He waved her off blindly, eyes still locked on the desk as if the wood grain might offer him a way out. He was pale now, not with embarrassment, but with collapse. The camera lights that had once loved him now felt like interrogation lamps. His chest rose too fast. Sweat pooled at his temples. The once proud silk tie around his neck twisted awkwardly, like it too wanted to flee the body it adorned. A man built for sound bites now couldn't summon a single word. Not because he had none, but because everything he might say would only dig the hole deeper. Across the bench, Justice Clarence Thomas had seen enough. He sat straighter, his black robe rippling slightly as he leaned forward. Not like a judge questioning a point of law, but like a man peering over the edge of something broken. His voice emerged slowly, each word pulled not from protocol, but from fury restrained by duty. Mr. Reed, he said, and the entire room stopped breathing. Even the courtroom lights seemed to hum quieter, as if the building itself was bracing for impact. Do you have anything to say before I proceed? It wasn't just a question. It was a final door creaking open, a last chance for dignity before the fall became permanent. And yet Reed, Harvard-trained, media-groomed, master of controlled narrative, said nothing. His mouth parted. No sound. His throat tightened. Still silence. Not even a whisper of defense. It wasn't that he didn't know how to spin it. It was that there was no spin left. The foundation beneath him, his arguments, his strategy, his power, had been built on buried evidence and manufactured doubt. And now the burial site had been dug up. Live. On camera. The silence stretched. Long enough for the nation watching to realize they were witnessing something rare. Not just a legal failure, but the public unraveling of a man who had confused ambition for justice. Not just shame, not just fear, but the dawning recognition that he had been used, and willingly so. Used by a machine bigger than himself to bring down a woman who simply refused to play by the rules of deference and silence. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. Her stillness said more than any celebration could. Across the aisle, her silence stood in perfect contrast to Reed's collapse. Where he scrambled, she endured. Where he broke, she waited. And that contrast between the woman who'd been falsely accused and the man who'd built the lie was now visible to the entire country. The courtroom was no longer a legal venue. It had become a mirror. And in that mirror, Malcolm Reed could no longer find the man he thought he was. With Reed's silence, the courtroom turned to the only man left with power. And for the first time in the entire hearing, Clarence Thomas looked like someone who no longer wanted it. Justice Thomas stood, not quickly, not grandly, but slowly, as if the very act of rising from the bench now carried the weight of consequence far greater than any ruling he had ever delivered. His palms pressed against the edge of the dark oak table, knuckles whitening, arms shaking ever so slightly. For decades, he had ruled from a place above the fray, untouchable, unreadable, immovable. But now the mask had cracked. His eyes, bloodshot and rimmed with exhaustion, swept across the courtroom. Not as a judge, but as a man standing in the wreckage of something he had helped build. When he spoke, the sound was not thunderous. It didn't need to be. It was quiet, low, and controlled. The voice of someone who had walked through fire and come out not proud, but scorched. This court, he began, pausing as his throat tightened, finds the judgment of $500 million levied against Representative Jasmine Crockett to be unjustified, procedurally compromised, and legally unsound. He inhaled deeply, not for drama, but to keep his voice from breaking. As of this moment, he continued, eyes locked forward, that judgment is vacated, nullified, erased. It no longer stands. Gasps echoed, audible, uncontrollable. In the press gallery, pens froze mid-sentence. A journalist dropped their phone. Even Jasmine's legal team, stoic until now, couldn't mask the flicker of shock that moved across their faces. But Jasmine herself remained still. Not in disbelief, in focus, because she had known the truth all along. What surprised her wasn't the reversal. It was the fact that the reversal came from him. Justice Thomas looked down at the table, almost as if ashamed to meet the eyes of the woman he had just tried to destroy. This should have never reached my bench, he said quietly, and yet it did. He looked up again, now with fire slowly returning to his posture. Not anger, but clarity. What this court has seen today is not merely the revelation of evidence, he said. It is the exposure of a pattern, one that suggests a deliberate effort within the Department of Justice to suppress truth in favor of narrative, one that weaponized the appearance of law to manufacture political defeat. The words cut like blades, but this time they weren't aimed at Jasmine. They were aimed at the very institution that had sent her here. I was used, he said plainly. The room stiffened. My name, my bench, my robe, used to launder a lie. He stepped out from behind the desk now, moving around it with slow, deliberate steps. This was no longer a ruling. It was a reckoning. I do not offer excuses, he said, but I do offer this. I will not allow this institution, one meant to protect the powerless, to be turned into a hammer for the powerful. Not again. Not under my watch. He returned to the center of the chamber and turned to face both the defense and prosecution tables. Therefore, he continued, effective immediately, I am authorizing a formal judicial inquiry, an open and independent review, into the conduct of the Department of Justice related to this case, and others in which exculpatory evidence may have been withheld or manipulated. A wave of stunned murmurs swept the room. Reporters exchanged wide-eyed glances. A court officer dropped their pen. No one had expected this, not even Jasmine, because this wasn't just a ruling in her favor. It was a signal that the shield of power had cracked open from the inside. Justice Thomas turned back toward the bench and rested one hand on it again. Not as a master of the room, but as a man who had finally stepped out of shadow. This court, he said slowly, is not adjourned, because this hearing is no longer about one woman's guilt or innocence. It is now about the system that put her here. A long silence followed, not the awkward silence of uncertainty, but the heavy silence that falls right before the storm. This wasn't the end of a trial. It was the beginning of an investigation. And this time, the accused wasn't Jasmine Crockett. It was everything that had tried to bury her. Justice had cracked the surface, but Jasmine knew better than to mistake a crack for a cure. What was exposed yesterday had been buried for years, and if she didn't act now, it would simply learn how to hide better. At precisely 9:31 a.m., the doors of the old federal building's East Conference Room opened, not with fanfare, but with a quiet that hummed with anticipation. Reporters filed in, elbow to elbow, their faces lit more by tension than camera light. They weren't there for spin. They were there for something rarer, the aftermath of truth. There was no staging, no campaign flags or handlers. Just one podium, one mic, and Jasmine Crockett standing alone beneath a bare fluorescent light like a witness testifying before the nation. Her expression wasn't stern. It was clear, like polished stone after rain. No makeup touch-ups, no smile for the cameras. This wasn't a performance. This was a reckoning in plain language. She didn't open with pleasantries. She didn't thank the press. She just began. "If you're expecting fury," she said, her voice measured and low, "you won't find it here today. If you're expecting revenge, look elsewhere. I didn't survive what happened yesterday to shout at a podium. I'm here to deliver the one thing that almost cost me everything, the truth." The room stilled. Boom mics crept forward. Even the skeptical, the cynical, the disillusioned in the back of the room leaned in. Not because she was loud, but because she refused to flinch. "My name was dragged through the mud," she said calmly. "My reputation was nearly destroyed. I stood trial without evidence. I was sentenced without argument. And the system, your system, my system, was ready to bury me under $500 million. Because I wouldn't play by the rules they never wrote down, but always enforced." A murmur rippled through the room. Some looked down. Others looked stunned. Jasmine let the silence breathe, then pressed forward. "I'm still standing," she said, quieter now, "but I refuse to be the exception. I didn't walk out of that courtroom just to clear my name. I walked out to make sure the next person never has to stand where I stood, with nothing but a spine and the hope that someone, somewhere, would still care about facts." She adjusted the single sheet of paper in her hand, no script, just a handwritten outline in blue ink, and looked straight ahead. "So today, I'm introducing 3 reform proposals. Not because they're easy, but because they are necessary. And because if Congress won't act, the people will know who stayed silent." She held up one finger. "First, a law mandating the full and immediate disclosure of exculpatory evidence. No more withholding. No more, we'll deliver it later. If the government has information that proves your innocence, it goes on the record. Immediately, non-negotiable. Because hiding the truth is not a legal strategy, it's a crime." That last sentence landed like a hammer. Some in the back gasped. Others scribbled as if racing against history. She held up a second finger. "Second, real whistleblower protection, not symbolic, not buried in subclauses, real. Legal immunity from retaliation, independent channels, emergency legal defense funds. Because no one should have to choose between their conscience and their career, and no public servant should ever lose sleep wondering if exposing corruption will cost them everything. The truth should not be a suicide mission." You could hear a pin drop. In that moment, the political theater of Washington felt far away, because this didn't sound like a press conference. It sounded like a woman reading the terms of battle. She raised a third and final finger. Third, a bipartisan Judicial Oversight Council, permanent, independent, with teeth, appointed equally by both parties, empowered to investigate misconduct by judges, prosecutors, and federal agencies. No more immunity cloaked in robes. No more hiding behind procedure. If someone manipulates justice for political gain, they will be named, they will be investigated, and they will be held accountable in daylight. She stepped back slightly, letting those final words sink like anchors into the room. No one clapped. No one dared to. This wasn't that kind of moment, and yet her silence after that final proposal spoke louder than any slogan. Jasmine didn't move, didn't blink, didn't soften her stance to win favor. Because this wasn't about charisma. It was about clarity. Steel wrapped in civility. Fire behind glass. Her voice dropped to a whisper, but the kind of whisper you remember forever. Yesterday, I was the one on trial. Today, I'm here to put the system on notice. We are not afraid. We are not confused. And we are not going anywhere. One final beat passed. Then she stepped away from the microphone. No theatrics, no victory lap. Only the sound of quiet conviction in the start of something unstoppable. The truth had been spoken. But in America, even truth needs a megaphone. And just when Jasmine's voice began to ripple, the world got something louder than her words. A confession caught on tape. It began as a file no one expected. Just another anonymous upload in a corner of the internet crowded with noise. The file name was plain, DOJMT call internal 721 final. No tags, no description, just a blurry thumbnail and a runtime of 4 minutes and 32 seconds. A low-level researcher for a watchdog nonprofit happened to click it during a late-night scroll, expecting bureaucratic monotony. What she heard instead made her sit upright, then stand. On screen, a half-dozen Justice Department officials filled a virtual meeting window, unaware, or perhaps arrogantly indifferent, to the fact that their conversation was being recorded. Their voices were casual, their expressions tired but calm. The tone was not one of urgency, but of certainty. And then came the sentence. Carl Hensley, Deputy Director of DOJ Public Affairs, leaned back in his chair and spoke without blinking. We need to move now. If we don't neutralize Crockett before the midterms, she's going to become unstoppable. She's media fluent, reform-minded, and, worst of all, undeniably clean. She'll own the narrative, unless we take her out before she has a platform. No one objected. A woman off-screen laughed nervously. Clarify? Take her out? How? He didn't miss a beat. Leak something. Invent something. It's not hard. You saw what we did with Hope Forward? Run the numbers, find the holes, bury the truth in paperwork. People won't check. People want clean headlines. Give them a villain, not a verdict. Another official interrupted, concerned. Wait, are we still recording this? 5 seconds of silence followed. 5 seconds of blinking, frozen faces. Then someone cursed. The screen went black. The file hit X, formerly Twitter, by 7:38 a.m. Eastern. By 8:05, it had been reposted 40,000 times. By 9 a.m., every major news outlet was running it on loop. It bypassed politics. It bypassed race. It bypassed debate. It was raw evidence, a digital bullet, fired not at Jasmine Crockett, but at the very heart of American justice. The hashtags #, DOJ conspiracy, #, Crockett was set up, and #, they said neutralize her trended in over 30 countries. TikTok exploded with split-screen reactions. Veterans in tears, lawyers seething, students stunned into silence. On Reddit, legal experts broke down federal code line by line, explaining how many laws had just been shattered in one call. People weren't asking for accountability. They were demanding it with fire in their veins. Protests erupted in over a dozen cities by nightfall. Not because they were organized, but because they were inevitable. In D.C., demonstrators surrounded the Department of Justice with signs reading, "She spoke, they schemed," and "Whistleblowers save nations." In Dallas, someone painted Jasmine's face 8 feet high on the side of a courthouse wall with the words, "Truth survives." Inside the halls of Congress, the mood changed like a flip breaker. Silence turned to panic. Backdoor whispers became urgent strategy sessions. Members of both parties realized this wasn't a political problem. It was a constitutional one. At 6:14 p.m., the House Oversight Committee called an emergency session. By unanimous bipartisan vote, an anomaly in the modern era, they authorized public hearings into misconduct, conspiracy, and obstruction inside the DOJ. The subpoenas flew fast. Carl Hensley was placed on unpaid leave within the hour. By the time he exited the DOJ's front entrance, cameras were waiting, clicking like gunfire. His jaw clenched. He said nothing. Reporters shouted over each other, "Did you mean to say it?" Was the trial against Jasmine Crockett rigged? Do you regret anything? He didn't answer. He couldn't, because the nation already had the answer. By morning, 3 senior DOJ officials were suspended pending investigation. Anonymous sources confirmed more were coming. The Inspector General launched a full-scale internal audit, and Senate hearings were announced for the following week. The New York Times front-page headline read, "DOJ on trial." The Washington Post followed with, "She was right." But the most shared headline came from a small independent outlet that had followed Jasmine's journey from the beginning. Jasmine Crockett didn't just survive, she triggered the reckoning. This wasn't just fallout, it was a tectonic shift. Because for the first time in a long time, the American public had seen exactly how truth is buried. They had heard the voices, they had watched the silence, and they had felt the system crack, not from the outside, but from within. And in the center of it all stood a woman they had tried to erase. Not louder than her enemies, but more unshakable than their lies. The hearings exposed the rot. The footage lit the fire. But it was Jasmine's pen, steady, relentless, unshaking, that carved reform out of the ashes. It was introduced on a Monday morning with no press conference, no polished rollout. Just a single-page draft slid onto the desk of the House Judiciary Committee like a legal grenade. Its title was unassuming, the Transparent Justice Act. But the language within read like a declaration of war against everything the system had weaponized against her. Every line of the bill was forged in the fire Jasmine had just walked through. No abstractions, no legal gymnastics, just raw clarity. Section 1. Immediate and mandatory disclosure of all exculpatory evidence in any federal case, regardless of political implications or prosecutorial convenience. Section 2. Felony-level penalties for any federal official who knowingly suppresses such evidence. Section 3. The creation of an independent oversight council, free from party appointments, with full investigatory power over DOJ and federal courts. It wasn't written in flowery rhetoric. It read like a scalpel. Opponents expected her to stumble, to grandstand, to politicize. But Jasmine didn't come to Washington to play defense. She came to build a firewall for herself and for anyone who'd ever been railroaded in the shadows. When she introduced the bill on the floor, she didn't pound the podium. She didn't raise her voice. She said with devastating calm, "If they could do it to me, with cameras watching and a title before my name, what do you think they're doing to people who have nothing but their name?" A silence spread like a wave. Even those who had once mocked her as too bold, too angry, or too much, sat back in their chairs and listened, not out of courtesy, but because something in her voice refused to be ignored. What followed was not politics. It was momentum. Jasmine became the lightning rod for a movement that had no leader until that moment. Civil rights organizations, whistleblower groups, veterans coalitions, and legal associations all lined up behind the bill. Conservative think tanks called it painfully necessary. Liberal watchdogs labeled it the first real reform in decades. Voters, millions of them, lit up the phone lines of their representatives. Offices were overwhelmed. One junior staffer leaked a screenshot of a constituent inbox titled, "You vote no, you're done." Inside Congress, the resistance collapsed like a brittle wall. Senators who had privately whispered doubts about the optics now gave floor speeches quoting Jasmine word for word. House members who once kept their distance from her were now begging to co-sponsor. The bill cleared committee with a unanimous vote. It passed the House 412 to 23. The Senate, famously gridlocked, famously slow, voted 92 to 8 in favor. One senator, known for rarely backing reform, was asked by reporters why he flipped. His answer was simple. "I saw what they tried to do to her, and I saw how she responded." When the bill reached the White House, the signing ceremony was unlike any in recent memory. No balloons, no fanfare, just a single desk in the Rose Garden. The president sat with the Transparent Justice Act before him and motioned for Jasmine to stand beside him. Cameras rolled, staffers held their breath. Jasmine didn't reach for the pen. She didn't need to. She let the moment breathe. She stood still, unblinking, as the president signed her bill into law and then handed her the pen. She accepted it with both hands, not as a trophy, but as a promise. She said only one sentence. No applause line. No victory lap. This is not a win. This is a warning. A warning to the next official who thinks they can rig a courtroom. A warning to the next prosecutor who weighs optics over evidence. A warning to a system that has, for too long, thrived in shadows and silence. Her words landed like steel striking stone, and the ripples didn't fade. That sentence would be quoted in legal textbooks, printed on protest signs, tattooed on forearms. And just like that, the Transparent Justice Act became law, 60 days after Jasmine's name was nearly erased by it all. In a country drowning in gridlock, fear, and division, one woman turned a personal crucifixion into national transformation. She didn't do it by shouting. She did it by surviving, and then refusing to stop there. The law had passed, the headlines had quieted, and cable networks still begged for her face. But Jasmine Crockett slipped out of Washington like a rumor refusing to be monetized. She turned down every invitation, from morning talk shows eager for a redemption arc to primetime pundits hungry to frame her as either savior or threat. And instead she rented a scuffed white sedan and drove south on Interstate 35, as if fleeing a storm no radar could trace. She reached South Dallas at dusk, parking outside the same cinderblock community center where she'd once volunteered to help teens expunge minor records the city refused to erase. Inside, the air smelled of floor wax and old basketballs, the fluorescent lights buzzing like tired bees. She unfolded a plastic chair, sat at a wobbling card table, and opened a spiral notebook to a blank page. Word traveled fast. No press releases, just text chains and whispered disbelief. And by nightfall, a line of neighbors stretched out the door. A single mother balancing 2 jobs and a broken childcare voucher, a laid-off mechanic whose disability claim had stalled, a high school senior clutching rejection letters, and a dream deferred. Jasmine listened, pen moving in quiet loops, asking questions no reporter had bothered with. What did the eviction notice actually say? Who at the DMV kept losing your paperwork? Which judge had dismissed your wage theft complaint without explanation? At 10 p.m., the building's heater rattled off, and her breath curled in front of her, yet she kept writing until her ink ran dry, promising nothing except the truth that someone was finally listening. When the custodian flicked the lights, she helped stack chairs, tucked her notes into an envelope, and walked out beneath a sky the color of bruised steel, unnoticed except by a cat perched on a busted railing. She drove to a budget motel off Loop 12, ate a stale granola bar, and studied her notes until her eyelids burned. Because victory speeches don't fix cracked sidewalks or close clinics. And somewhere between midnight and dawn, an idea took shape, fragile and luminous. Maybe the real legacy of a courtroom battle isn't the statute it births, but the faith it resurrects in people who long ago stopped believing anyone in power could hear them. The next afternoon, she was in Jackson, Mississippi, standing outside a storm-battered church whose steeple leaned like a question mark against the gray sky. Folding chairs formed an imperfect circle on the cracked asphalt. Jasmine took the last empty seat, coat draped over her knees, as a veterans support group began trading stories of lost benefits and folded flags. A man with a prosthetic leg described waiting 9 months for a replacement socket. A woman who'd served in Desert Storm said her PTSD claim had been denied because her medical records were misplaced. Jasmine didn't interrupt, didn't flash a business card, didn't mention the Transparent Justice Act. She simply wrote, nodding to show she heard each detail, her silence sharper than any speech. When the stories wound down, an older veteran in a faded 82nd Airborne cap leaned forward, eyes glassy, and asked, "You gonna run for president now that you saved the system?" A ripple of laughter broke the tension, but Jasmine shook her head and said, "I didn't save the system. I just proved it bleeds." The circle fell quiet. The veteran reached across the gap, weathered hand trembling, and squeezed hers. "You did what we thought nobody dared do anymore," he whispered, voice rough with years of dust and diesel. Phones should have captured it, but no reporters were there. Only the creak of folding metal and the slow breath of people daring to hope. That night, someone spray-painted those words on an abandoned factory wall downtown. By morning, photos of the makeshift mural had traveled farther than any network segment could reach. And yet Jasmine stayed invisible to the algorithms, refusing to trend, because transformation, she believed, grows best where cameras don't trample the soil. A week later, she found herself in Flint, Michigan, seated at a Formica table in a shuttered corner store, repurposed as a pop-up legal clinic. The winter wind rattled plywood sheets over broken windows, but inside the light of three space heaters glowed like embers around a circle of elderly residents clutching bottled water. They told her about rashes that wouldn't fade, children's teeth crumbling, houses still worthless after a crisis the news cycle had long since abandoned. Jasmine listened, jaw tight, knuckles white around a styrofoam cup gone cold. One grandmother described paying 2 utility bills, one for poison water she feared to use, another for jugs she drove 6 miles to purchase, while debit card fees ate into her Social Security check. Jasmine wrote every number, every date, every name of every official who had promised relief and delivered none. A volunteer offered her a microphone for Facebook Live, but she declined, saying, "They've shared their pain enough. Today I'm here to carry it, not broadcast it." When the session ended, she boxed 2 folders of affidavits, taped them shut, and mailed them overnight to the new oversight council her law had created, adding a sticky note that read, "Case 001, Flint." Before leaving, she knelt beside a young mother whose toddler coughed in jagged bursts and whispered, "I can't promise speed, but I can promise daylight." The woman wept into her sleeve. Jasmine's own eyes burned, but she stood, shoulders squared, and stepped back into the cold. Because duty isn't a cape, it's a weight you choose to keep lifting. Stories like these multiplied until Jasmine's notebooks filled a suitcase. Eviction stats from Baltimore, bail bond gouging in New Orleans, ICE hold errors in Bakersfield, courthouse interpreter shortages in Flagstaff. She moved quietly, swapping rental cars weekly, paying cash for motel rooms, shunning the entourage a security advisor insisted she hire. Sometimes she woke before dawn to run through unfamiliar streets, lungs aching, mind cataloging patterns. Which communities lacked legal aid? Which judges repeated the same creditor-friendly rulings? Which police districts dismissed whistleblowers for daring to log evidence into the wrong bin? Each night she typed a summary under the same heading, "When the powerful shake because the truth stands tall," and emailed it to the Oversight Council's public archive, daring them to leave her reports unread. And though trolls online mocked her for playing Mother Teresa, real change began to stir. A county clerk in Georgia reinstated 300 expunged records after her inquiry. A Midwest hospital reversed its policy on billing unpaid rape kit fees. A Texas judge recused himself from eviction court after her dossier proved he owned stock in the property management firm, filing half the cases. None of it made national news. That was by design. Jasmine didn't need applause. She needed precedent. One rainy evening in Houston, at a community potluck held under a leaking gym roof, a frail woman with silver braids shuffled forward, using a walker whose wheels squealed on slick concrete. Jasmine rose to pull out a chair, but the woman shook her head and lifted a trembling hand. "Sit," she insisted. Jasmine obeyed. The woman grasped her fingers, skin paper thin but grip iron strong, and said, voice soft yet carrying through the echoing hall, "Child, you did something we feared was extinct. You made the powerful tremble." People nearby fell silent. Even the children chasing a deflated basketball stopped to listen. "Promise me," the woman continued, "you'll keep that courage alive, because if truth doesn't stand, we got nothing left." Jasmine swallowed hard, throat tight, and answered, "The courage is yours, I'm just passing it forward." Someone recorded the exchange on a shaky phone, but by morning the clip had been reposted thousands of times. The final line captioned in white letters, "When the powerful tremble because truth stands tall, that's when justice begins." Law students stenciled it onto dorm walls. A professor in Vermont opened every lecture with the quote. A legal aid office in Oakland painted it above their reception desk. It spread not like a slogan, but like a compass bearing, pointing to a north most people had forgotten existed. By summer, journalists finally traced Jasmine to a dusty town outside Tulsa, where she was helping organize pro bono representation for Native families battling pipeline seizures. Cameras arrived in a frenzy, but she stepped aside, directing them to elders whose land deeds dated back to 1905. When a correspondent asked why she still refused primetime interviews, she answered with a weary smile, "Because the story was never me. The story is what happens when everyday voices chain themselves together and refuse to whisper." He pressed her, asking whether she'd run for higher office, whether she feared fading from relevance. Jasmine closed her notebook, looked him in the eye and said, "Relevance is a mirror the powerful hold up to themselves. I'm here to build windows." That line led the evening broadcast, yet she declined their offer of a follow-up, opting instead to spend the night drafting a grant proposal for a mobile legal clinic housed in a retrofitted city bus. Grants didn't trend, but they changed lives. Late one October afternoon, Jasmine returned to the South Dallas Community Center, where it had all begun. The same custodian, now wearing a freshly pressed uniform, greeted her with a broad smile and a handshake that lasted longer than protocol. Inside, rows of new computers glowed under LED lights, funded by a settlement her evidence had helped secure. Teenagers edited resumes Jasmine's staff had taught them to write, while a small plaque above the entrance quoted the words that had traveled the nation. She sat on a plastic chair, knees aching from months on the road, and watched an 11-year-old boy teach his grandmother how to send her first email. A volunteer offered to announce her presence over the PA system. Jasmine declined. She exhaled, allowing herself a rare moment of stillness, and realized this: quiet connection, uninvented hope, was the victory no verdict could award. Her phone buzzed with yet another network request. She silenced it without reading. Fame is loud, she thought, but justice flourishes in whispers shared around chip tables. That night, as she drove toward a horizon painted purple by city lights, her radio picked up a college station debating the new constitutional amendments her act had inspired. A caller quoted the mural, "When the powerful tremble." Jasmine smiled, but her eyes stayed on the road. There were more towns to visit, more stories to witness, more truths to anchor. She gripped the steering wheel, knuckles pale, resolute as asphalt stretched ahead. The system could adapt, hide, rebrand, but it would never again forget the sound of its own marble cracking under the steady weight of one woman's unshakable calm. And somewhere, in a law class she would never meet, a student underlined that quote for the 10th time, feeling something flicker back to life. A conviction that justice wasn't an institution, but a stance. Jasmine Crockett drove on, headlights carving through darkness, carrying that stance in the quiet beat of her heart. Proof that the mighty can tremble, and the truth, once it stands, doesn't kneel again. The cameras faded, the crowds dispersed, and what remained was not the spectacle of victory, but the quiet question every witness now had to answer. What does Jasmine Crockett's fight mean for the rest of us? The first lesson rises like smoke from the rubble of her trial. Justice is never a fixed monument, but a battlefield that must be reclaimed every generation. And the moment we assume the law will guard itself, it can be hijacked by those who sharpen statutes into spears. Jasmine's ordeal teaches that silence in the face of administrative convenience or institutional arrogance is complicity, for the system did not simply malfunction. It conspired, calculating optics over evidence, hoping the public would trade curiosity for outrage. Yet it shattered the instant one woman demanded receipts, proving that even the most fortified deception unravels when confronted by relentless fact-finding. Her stand warns us that power respects neither innocence nor merit without sustained pressure, and that due process is meaningless if the people inside the courthouse do not fear accountability. Therefore, the human duty is vigilance, the daily discipline of reading past headlines, of questioning sealed files, of refusing to let legal jargon drown moral sense. It is our obligation to remember that constitutions may enshrine rights, but only citizens can animate them, and every unchecked corner of governance becomes a breeding ground for quiet tyranny. Above all, this chapter screams that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to barter truth for personal safety, because intimidation tactics, be they billion-dollar fines or whispered threats, work only when we believe we stand alone. The second lesson glows in the aftermath like a fuse still burning. Stories change policy faster than statistics ever will, and the human narrative, fierce, flawed, unmistakably real, is the lever that moves legislative stone. Jasmine could have recited chart after chart on prosecutorial misconduct, yet nothing pierced hearts until the nation watched her dignity being auctioned in open court. So we learn that empathy is the engine of reform, that people rally when injustice is incarnated in a face, a voice, a trembling hand. It reminds advocates that data must wear flesh to matter, that behind every percentage point lies a grandmother's eviction, a veteran's unpaid claim, a child's shattered future. The moral recoil triggered by that leaked DOJ clip proved facts alone are inert until fused with human context. And once fused, they ignite with unstoppable heat. Thus, the citizen's calling is to bear witness and retell what institutions would prefer to redact, because darkness retreats less from argument than from exposure. Each of us carries a story, our own or one entrusted to us, and the Republic depends on our willingness to lift that story high enough to be seen, even when our knees shake. In that lifting, we discover solidarity, for outrage multiplies when shared, turning singular pain into collective resolve, an alchemy Jasmine mastered and then handed to the masses like a torch. The third lesson breathes through her refusal of celebrity. Authentic leadership rejects the narcotic of applause, choosing instead the slow, grinding labor of listening. For real power is not measured by how many microphones beg for your soundbite, but by how many unheard voices you amplify. Jasmine turned her back on lucrative booking fees because she understood that hero worship freezes progress at the moment of triumph, trapping reform inside a personality cult, while true change demands leaders who step aside so communities can step forward. Her plastic chair pilgrimages model a politics rooted in proximity, the belief that policy drafted without sitting in the cold with those it serves will always calcify into performative pity. She teaches that travel to the margins is mandatory, that empathy cannot be phoned in from a green room, and that legislation untested by kitchen table confession will crumble at first contact with reality. In following her footsteps, we're challenged to exchange performative outrage for practical solidarity, answering emails from strangers, attending local hearings, translating legalese for neighbors who have never stepped inside a courthouse. She exposes the lie that complex problems require distant experts alone, showing instead that solutions bloom when the governed co-author the governing. Her humility reframes success, not a spotlight's glare, but the soft affirmation in an elder's eyes when she whispers, "You made the powerful tremble." The fourth lesson hammers like a drumbeat under every scene. Institutions reform not from constructed civility, but from sustained disruption. And disruption begins with whistleblowers who risk livelihood for the liberty of strangers. Jasmine's vindication hinged on a single envelope slipped through a crack in the wall, proving that history sometimes pivots on anonymous courage. Yet that bravery withers without communal scaffolding, so her Transparent Justice Act codifies sanctuary for truth-tellers, reminding us that moral ecosystems require legal armor. In this, we grasp our shared responsibility to defend those who speak inconvenient facts, sharing their stories, crowdfunding their defenses, voting out officials who retaliate in darkness. The humane duty is to build a culture where secrecy is shameful and transparency an expectation, not an exception, because sunlight delayed is justice denied. Every workplace, every agency, every boardroom hides someone weighing the cost of revelation tonight. And Jasmine's saga pleads with us to make that cost bearable, to be the network that catches the leper before the machinery of retaliation can crush them. Our collective future depends on treating whistleblowers not as traitors, but as guardians of the social contract. The fifth lesson surfaces in her quiet mantra. Truth stands, power shakes, and it challenges our definition of victory. The goal is not the humiliation of adversaries, but the realignment of systems toward fairness, for vengeance might satisfy the wounded ego, yet leave structures intact. Jasmine accepted Thomas's tearful reversal not as triumph over a man, but as leverage to indict the machinery behind him, converting personal redemption into systemic reckoning. She models the discipline of rejecting easy vindication, press tours, bestseller deals, partisan weaponization, in favor of painstaking reform that endures after the cameras pack up. The humanist takeaway is that justice transcends personalities, that a society matures when it stops celebrating fallen villains and starts redesigning the stage that birthed them. In practical terms, it means demanding audits, rewriting rules, funding oversight instead of parades. It urges us to track results, flipped convictions, reopen cases, budgets shifted toward public defenders, because symbolism without metrics is sentiment masquerading as progress. Each citizen inherits the duty to measure change, to keep receipts, to refuse to let momentum dissipate into nostalgia. The sixth lesson pulses through her cross-country listening tour. Proximity to pain is a curriculum no ivory tower can replicate, teaching that reform authored in marble halls must be field-tested in neighborhoods where streetlights flicker. Jasmine's nights in motels and mornings in union halls reveal injustice as a mosaic of local indignities. Water bills, bail fees, zoning laws, magnified into national crisis. We learn that democracy thrives when policymakers log miles, not media minutes, when they collect anecdotes with the rigor of scholars and return with solutions tailored like handmade shoes. She proves that dignity is restored not by federal proclamations alone, but by a legislator sitting on a stoop explaining a new form in plain language. Her example calls each of us to shrink the distance between our daily routines and the communities bleeding under our policies, volunteering at eviction court, attending school board meetings, translating ballot guides. In doing so, we dismantle the myth that government is a distant monolith, rediscovering it as a mirror of collective engagement. The seventh lesson gleams in the murals and lecture hall quotes: symbols matter, words endure, and a single sentence can outlive 1,000 press releases. When the powerful tremble because truth stands tall, that's when justice begins, has become more than graffiti. It's a liturgy recited by law students before moot court finals, a banner hanging in public defender offices, a screen print on protest banners from Atlanta to Anchorage. Jasmine's story reminds storytellers, teachers, parents that language is ammunition in the fight for equity, able to rally despairing hearts and crystallize diffuse anger into disciplined action. It challenges each of us to craft our own justice mantra, brief enough to fit on a bus bench, yet deep enough to steer a movement. Because movements sustain on repetition, and repetition shapes memory, and memory anchors accountability. Celebrate phrases that summon courage. Distribute them like seeds. Paint them where children can't miss them. In time, they will germinate in legislative chambers, corporate boardrooms, jury deliberations. Finally, the eighth lesson, perhaps the fiercest, lurks in her refusal to claim a pedestal. Leadership is a relay, not a throne, and the torch must keep moving lest the flame become decoration. Jasmine's journey sparks countless successors: the single mother who now speaks at city council, the veteran who organizes claim clinics, the law student launching a whistleblower hotline. Her legacy insists we stop outsourcing courage to public figures and instead locate it in ourselves, repeating her quiet creed. The system changes when ordinary people decide they're tired of praying for someone else to save them. This ethos dismantles the spectatorship that politics too often breeds, inviting each witness to graduate from audience to actor. The fight ahead, against algorithmic bias, prison profiteering, environmental apartheid, requires armies of Jasmines, each carrying a piece of the broader load. So the narrative closes not with a statue but with an empty space beside her plastic chair, waiting for the next person to sit, listen, and act. The story's final charge is clear. Pick up the notebook, join the circle, write the next chapter. Because justice, like a muscle, only grows when ordinary hands refuse to let it atrophy in silence. And so the human lesson crystallizes. When institutions quake and headlines fade, the measure of a society is not whether it crowns new heroes, but whether it multiplies everyday guardians of truth. People who, armed with empathy and evidence, stand so firmly that even the mighty cannot help but tremble. But what good is a lesson if it stays trapped on a mural, in a headline, or behind the courtroom door? Now it's your turn. This isn't just Jasmine Crockett's story. It's a warning and a weapon. If you felt rage watching her silenced, if your hands clenched when the truth was buried beneath a $500 million lie, then don't just remember it, respond. This system doesn't change by accident. It bends only when enough people pull at it. Call your representatives, demand transparency laws with real teeth. Show up at town halls and ask where your local judges stand on accountability. Support whistleblowers, volunteer legal aid hours, start community oversight groups. And if you've been silent until now, speak, because silence is what lets this machine keep grinding people like Jasmine into dust. Be louder than the gavels meant to shut you down. Because here's the truth. Injustice doesn't fear outrage. It fears organization. And the next time a courtroom tries to crucify truth to protect power, it shouldn't just be one woman standing. It should be all of us. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.